Hello, everyone. We are so excited to have you join us for this another amazing webinar, which is all about gastric ulcers. And I'll talk more in a moment about our amazing panel that we've got here. But what I'm finding is that we are constantly learning and sharing our knowledge at Poseidon. But gastric ulcers is one of those topics that horse owners struggle with so much. So the idea of tonight's webinar is to try and address all the questions that we know that you have. Things that we know people get concerned about, confusion, like what are they? How do we manage them? How do we treat them? Our plan tonight is to make it easier for you to understand what it is we're talking about when it comes to gastric ulcers. So I mentioned that we have an incredible panel. For those of you who don't know me, I am Linda Goldsfink-Lord, and I'm proud to say that I'm the founder of Poseidon Animal Health. It's been a journey that constantly amazes me, and we are always committed to education. It's not just about delivering amazing evidence-based products. It's about sharing with you the knowledge that we have and bringing amazing people that can share information that you can trust. Because I think as horse owners, there is so much information out there, and there's also a lot of misinformation. So tonight you have access to people that are credible, they're experts, they're qualified to deliver the information that they're sharing with you. I'll talk about the outline in a moment, but I just want to ask each member of the panel to jump in and say hello. Dr. Erin Roddy will be joining us from Ocala in Florida, but it's about 3 a.m. for her. So she'll join in later on in the webinar. But for now, I'm going to ask Dr. Petra to introduce herself.
G'day, how's it going? I'm Dr. Petra Hazlett, and I'm an equine veterinarian based in Auckland, and I've worked closely with Nikita, and we found Varney together a few years ago, but worked closely trying to combine veterinary and nutritional things that work together. So I feel like ulcers and the number one thing that actually combine both of those things together. Super passionate about ulcers because I see it every day in my work, and love that Linda and the team are trying to find ways for us to maintain ulcer-free horses, because that is an absolute bane of my life, trying to figure out ways to stop them from coming back. So looking forward to hearing what everyone's got to say tonight.
Wonderful, Petra. And thank you so much for joining us. The combination of Nikita and Petra is so inspirational because you have equine nutritionist and an equine vet working together. And we'll talk later on about how important that combination is. So thank you for joining us. And Petra has so much experience that she can share with you. And Nikita's been working with Poseidon for a number of years now, and she is an amazing equine nutritionist. Sorry, Nikita, I've just jumped in and introduced you, but would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, thanks, Linda. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm so excited to be here tonight. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an equine nutritionist, and I'm based in the Bay of Plenty in New Zealand. I've got a particular interest in gut health, and as Petra mentioned, I was the co-founder of Varney. We started Varney in 2016. Because we really saw a need for horse owners to have some access to reliable information and education in this space. So really excited to be here and talk about gastric ulcers tonight. And something that you guys might not know about me is that I have converted probably too many kitchens into fecal sampling labs. So we'll get to talk a bit more about that later when we talk about some fecal pH and interesting things with regards to gut health. So looking forward to this evening.
Fabulous. Thank you, Nikita. We're very blessed at Poseidon to be in a position where we can offer this education, because it's not just about making one or two changes. We want this in a whole approach. How do we make our lives better for horses? And we'll explore that more in a moment. So I always start with stick around to the end, because we have 2 amazing prizes to give away, one for New Zealand and one for Australia. And we'll draw the winner right at the end. And it's a random draw, but we're very conscious about, give people a chance to want to stay to the end. But you want to anyway, because the information is so incredible. So what will we cover tonight? And we will try and stick to 1 hour in terms of information and allow time for questions at the end. If we actually won't be answering questions during tonight as we go, but what we want you to do is send your questions through, because like every webinar that we have, we will then compile those, send those to our panel of experts, and they will get answered. We will share the replay. Everyone always asks that. And we will also share all the answers to the questions. So feel free to write them down, send them through. Ideally, if we have time at the end, we'll allow 30 minutes at the end to take some questions live, and I'll be able to read through those and then ask our panel to ask those questions. So what are we covering? It's really about clarifying, what do we mean by gastric ulceration, and what are the different types of ulcers, and why is that important? And it's actually really important. I know from all the years of myself owning horses, we talk about gastric ulcers and we never actually understood there are different types. So that's really important. What are some of the early signs and what can you do about it? Because as horse owners, we just want the best all the time for our horses, but sometimes we get confused. And that's what we want to take that away from you tonight. Very much practical tips. How do you prevent gastric ulcers, regardless of the type, and then how do you manage them? What do? You think your horse has got ulcers? What is the next step? Also talk about the importance of scoping, and Petra will take us through that, because that's also something really important. And we'll talk about some of the challenges, but what do you need to know about scoping? We'll talk about the role of gut health. I mean, gastric ulcers are a very important topic, but the stomach makes only one part of this massive 30-meter gut in the horse. So what does it all mean? And then we'll go into looking at ulcer-friendly diets and management. And you will love that, because Nikita will share with you some simple tips on how do you create a diet for a horse that's ulcer prone, or also how do you prevent ulcers? And we try and keep diets simple, because again, it's another thing we just get so overwhelmed about and confused about, and we want to take the confusion away. And at the end, we've got a couple of great case studies trying to pull it all together. So before I hand over to Petra, I just want to do a bit of a recap. And the more that I work in this space, the more that I get to travel the world and see horses across different environments, it's really clear that what we ask of our horses is stressful. And we tend to forget that. I feel like I get more and more passionate about this topic, because we underestimate the impact of our human domestic life on our horses. So, we ask them to travel, we ask them to compete. Sometimes they're in stables, they may not have a paddock buddy, it goes on and on. We do the best we can, but we do need to know it has an impact, and it has a huge impact on our horses. And we'll talk more about how does that show up. But the stress we place on them doesn't just create a risk of gastric ulcers. It can create a whole lot of things, like weight, managing weight, affecting our gut microbes of the horse, behavior changes. We'll talk later about pain associated with ulcers. How can a horse be happy and able to perform at its best when it's in pain? Because us as humans can't, so why do we expect that of our horses? We'll talk not so much tonight about bacterial imbalance, but they are part of that fragile ecosystem. And if we interrupt the system at the front of the gut, then it has this flow-on effect. And what does that mean for our horses? Our horses are showing up every day, literally as a flight animal and as a prey animal. They're just doing their best to survive. So how do we then work with them and try and manage the stresses that we're imposing on them? And so you can see there a picture of a gastric ulcer, literally open wounds in your horse's stomach. And I just want to do a very quick analogy, and I think it's something that we can relate to. And if any of you have ever had a mouth ulcer, even though they're tiny, they really hurt. And then imagine pouring lemon juice on that mouth ulcer all day. It would really, really hurt, and it would annoy you. And yet we talk about pH for those of you who understand science. So if lemon juice is about 2 to 3, it's still acidic. I mentioned that gastric ulcers are open wounds in your horse's stomach. Their stomach pH can get as low as 1. And so that hurts. That really hurts. And they make acid all day long. So we'll talk later about the different types of ulcers in the stomach. But if you've got the stomach about the size of a football and you've got open wounds and you've got stomach acid pouring in all day, then how does it show up? They might rear, they might bolt, or they just give up. It's not about guilt. This is about the reality that we need to understand the impact of gastric ulcers and gut health for our horses, and to understand that just because they're not showing any symptoms, they may not be as severe as this horse here, but they may have ulcers, and we have to stop guessing. And so the fact that you've turned up tonight and registered for this webinar, we're excited about, because then we can be part of the change, because I think it's time we all did better by our horses. And this picture is the one that gets you thinking. And it's time for us to rethink how we manage gastric ulcers, because this is a picture of a horse, and you can see that is a ulcerated, very sore stomach. Yet this horse was still competing at a high level. On the outside, everything looked okay, but it had actually been on long-term omeprazole. So tonight's about rethinking that you just can't look at the outside of a horse and know what's happening on the inside, which is why we have steps in place. And tonight we're focusing on gastric ulcers, but it's just one part of this whole gut that determines how well your horse performs, their appetite, their behavior, their recovery, everything. So we need to understand what we can do to do better by our horses. So again, thank you so much for joining us, and let's all be part of the change and doing better by our horses. So Petra, I'm going to hand over to you now.
All right, I'm just going to give you guys a quick overview of the horse's stomach and gut overall, just so you can get a bit of an idea where we're focusing on. It's a huge area. The picture outlines sort of easily the esophagus, the stomach, and the small intestine. That's the foregut. And then you've got the hindgut, the cecum, the large colon, and the small colon. That is a huge barrel size operation inside the horse. But when we talk about gastric ulcers, we're really just talking about things that happen inside the stomach. So I think there can be a bit of confusion that it might encompass the whole gut, and there are lots of other things that happen further down. But when we talk about gastric ulcers, we're really just referring to the stomach itself. And so it's actually quite a small part of the whole digestive system. It only accounts for 10%, and it's only about 9 to 15 litres, depending on the size of the horse. And there's two parts to the stomach. We've got the part, which is the squamous region, and the bottom part, which is the glandular region. Now, the acid sort of sits in the glandular region at the bottom, and it's protected. It's got a mucosal layer to stop acid from damaging it normally, and then it will splash up into the squamous region. And so there's no protection in the top part. So that's really important when we get into feeding and ways we can maintain things later, to think about that fact that the top part's not protected at all. So coming slowly. So what are gastric ulcers? As I said, there's two types of parts of the stomach, and then means there's actually two different types of ulcers. And one of the things we've discovered recently, we actually is really only been sort of the last 5 years that gastric, that scopes have been available. And before that, we didn't actually know there were really two types. So that's when we sort of used to do this blanket treatment. We just give every horse omeprazole and we'd think, oh, yep, they'll get better or they won't. Then we started scoping and we thought, oh my gosh, actually, there's more to be seen. We've got these top ulcers, the squamous ulcers. They're the ones in the top part of the stomach caused by acid splashback. They're the sort of common ones that you might think, oh, okay, yeah, my horse is sort of girthy or really grumpy. And they would respond to omeprazole. And then we were scoping more and we realized, oh my gosh, there's ulcers on the glandular region as well, the bottom ones. And these were actually really hard to get rid of. And omeprazole on its own wasn't going to cut it. And they're the ones that have more intermittent signs. They're actually harder to diagnose and harder to sort of determine without scoping. Where are we next? And I think one of the other things we sort of discussed when we were doing this talk is, are there specific signs for squamous ulcers and are there specific signs for glandular ulcers? And I think there are some more specific for each, but actually overall, there's such a variation. You can get signs like in the video that Linda showed you where the horses are actually really uncomfortable and unhappy, but you can get the most honest, delightful horses that will do anything anyway, and then they come into the clinic and you scope them and they have the most horrific ulcers. People treat them and they get a whole nother level of their horses they didn't know before. But there are some sort of listed up here, some definite kind of signs of things that you might see in horses, but there's such a range, and sometimes they get confused with lamenesses. We see horses that won't canter in one lead. We try everything. We spend a fortune on lamenesses, scope them, they've got ulcers. So there's sort of no one size fits all or one symptom for every sort of known ulcer. So the only real way that we can actually diagnose them is by scoping. I'm just trying to show, there's a little photo here of a squamous ulcer. Oh, hang on, sorry, something's coming up on my computer. And they're the ones that are at the top part of the stomach that we sort of used to treat with omeprazole. They're more related to dietary risk factors, especially exercising on an empty stomach. You can just imagine from an anatomy point of view, if there's nothing sitting in that stomach, that you're going to get, as you move along at any pace, you're going to get acid splash back up. And because there's no protection on there over time, that's sort of going to essentially burn a hole in that stomach lining. Also, if you have large gaps or long time between feeding your horses, naturally every time they chew and swallow, they swallow saliva, which is a basic, it counteracts the acid. But if they're not eating all the time, or you don't offer them food all the time, they won't get that interaction, and so the acid will still sort of damage without any something buffering it. Where are we now? And then the bottom types of ulcers, which are the ones that are much harder to find and to treat and take longer to heal. We sort of are still learning a lot about those. As I said, we only really in the last 5 years have started to learn about them. We don't know as much what causes them, or they're a lot harder to treat, but we know that horses that are exercised more than 5 times a week are more likely to have them. Horses that are in stressful situations, and there's definitely breed predispositions. The lovely warm blood seems to be able to cope a lot less with certain things, and so they seem to be more prone than some other types of horses. And then a sort of subset of the glandular ulcer is a pyloric ulcer. So in the stomach, the pylorus is the bit that just sort of empties. It almost looks like a bit of a sphincter. Well, it is. It empties into the small intestine. These ones can be quite tricky to diagnose because they're actually right around under the stomach. You've got actually, when you're scoping them, your horse has to swallow them, and sometimes we can't get to the pylorus, but most of the time we can. And also, again, a bit like the other glandular ulcers, they have quite non-specific signs, but I've found over time that these seem to be the most painful of the ulcers. So when we see sort of horses that have poor performance, often they will end up having glandular ulcers, in my experience. So is scoping important? I 100% think yes, it's so important. As I said, when we scope, we just do treatment trials, and some of them would work, some of them wouldn't, but we didn't really know when to stop treatment, and we didn't know what to treat with. We've got more than one option for treatment, not just omeprazole. And so we need to know what we're dealing with. And we also need to rescope and monitor healing to make sure that we keep them on for long enough, because we've had people that sort of get lost to follow up, and we get them back later and their horse have got ulcers again because they might have been like nearly healed and then they stop the treatment and they're back to where they began. So it is so important to get rid of those ulcers, and sometimes we get a month in and we have to add another treatment. So usually if we've got glandular ulcers, don't just stick to omeprazole. There's other products that we will look at, like sucralfate or misoprostol. I saw someone just asking about different options, and we could probably talk about that a bit later. One other, people are, I guess, worried that they're starving their horses overnight for scoping, so they do have to have nothing in their stomach. If we get there, it's a bit like a colonoscopy. If anyone's had them, there's a 3-day prep to get there, and we really need to be able to visualize the whole stomach. So you do have to starve your horse overnight, but the risks of doing that is just far outweighed the benefits of actually being able to get a correct diagnosis moving forward. We do usually in our clinic, we'll do a protocol where we'll withdraw food at 8 p.m. at night, and they can still have water. And then we'll withdraw water in the morning before they come in, and then we will scope them that. So usually about 12 to 14 hours without food. And so, it's not ideal because they are going to have acid on their stomach in that time, but the diagnosis is just so important to do it correctly. So should you treat them? And 100% yes. I guess where we're at the moment is that veterinary stuff is so important. You can't really get them to heal unless you're treating them. And then once you've treated them and they're gone, then you can look at the management of going back. But if you don't give the stomach a chance to heal, taking away like the acid, you're not really going to be able to fix them. So I 100% recommend that we treat them. And there's a couple of options, as I said earlier, but the ones for the squamous ulcers is that you're looking at using omeprazole, which is acid. And so it gives the stomach a chance to heal, yes, because it's not going to get acid bouncing back up on it in the same way. And the acid's not going to be as acidic, but it doesn't address the root cause. So it gives us a window, to start changing our management, which is what Nikita is going to talk about. Changing our management, our feed plans, the way we ride our horses, when we ride our horses, what time of day we're going to do all those things, which I'm not going to talk about because Nikita will. But
I think, Petra, that last point about that window and giving you time to make changes is so important, because omeprazole was never meant to be long-term forever. So it's almost, if you don't manage the risk factors, then nothing's going to change.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And we've got a lot more research going forward now, because a lot of racehorse trainers will just have every horse on omeprazole. They don't tend to scope, and they don't tend to think about going forward how they could change their management. But we've, even with human research, we know that omeprazole long term is really detrimental to calcium absorption and can affect bone health. So for me, it's a bit of a concern in terms of fractures in young racehorses that live on it, and we're still learning about that kind of data. We're sort of worried as well it might not be as effective long term, and that if you do suddenly stop for any reason, that you'll get a massive acid reflux or rebound, and you'll be back sort of worse off than where you started. And also that it interacts with other medications. So we just need to be aware of some of these things and try and use it, as I sort of put in the next one. It's a bit of a band-aid to fix things, to try and get on top of the ulcers with treatment, and then moving forward from that, we're always looking for ways to try and prevent them coming back and maintaining a different lifestyle or a different management routine for our horses so they don't come back. And I think there's still lots of areas of research to do this, and we definitely lose horses to follow up. We talked about this in a pre-meeting. We'd love to do some research on some follow-up later on horses that we've got rid of ulcers with medically and then moved on to some other sort of products like the Poseidon products, and then can we keep them away? And so I think these guys have done an amazing job in devising something that we never sort of had before. So exciting from a veterinary perspective, because we don't want to have to see horses keep coming back and being on treatment all the time.
I think, Petra, thank you so much for that. And for me, what that reinforces is that if you are getting your horse scoped for ulcers, and because I get this all the time, they'll ring and say, my horse has got ulcers, and I go, well, what part of the stomach? And they'll go, I don't know, I didn't ask. It's really important you do ask, because we'll talk more about, we've spoken about treatment, but there is different treatment. So ask the questions. And that's been probably in the last few years that we've learned that, because I remember years ago with my own horses that, I somehow miraculously decided to diagnose them myself. I didn't scope all the time. I used the omeprazole on and off. I had no idea that I'm turning the acid on and off, on and off. I spoke earlier about that. You affect one part of the stomach, and then we have this roll-on effect. And we don't really know what happens when you stop acid production long-term. It changes the pH. What happens to the next sort of microbes that are in the small intestine, and so on and so on. So it's really important you ask those questions. And then Petra mentioned that cycle of long-term omeprazole use. And you saw that photo of that horse with that awful ulcerated stomach that had been on omeprazole. Omeprazole doesn't work all the time. It doesn't mean you don't follow the vet's practice, but you have to look at what are the other risk factors, which then leads us into Nikita talking about, well, how do we prevent ulcers from reoccurring or even happening in the first place? And there's so much great information that she'll be sharing. So over to you, Nikita. Thank you, Petra. That was brilliant too, by the way.
Thanks, Linda and Petra. So that, I think, was just such a great introduction to gastric ulcers and some of the misconception around ulceration and treatment and what they are. One of the things I hear a lot in the field is, oh, my horse has hindgut ulcers. And I think what they're talking about is the pyloric ulcers and those ulcers that Petra talked about that are a bit harder to find and treat. So it's really nice to have that overview as a start. And one of the other things that I see a lot of in the field is reoccurrence. And that's simply because we are just not changing the management when we're treating our horse. And I think that's a real shame, because like Petra mentioned, we've got a window of opportunity to treat our horses with gastric ulcers, and then we really need to assess that management, whether that be through exercise, feeding, or both. So hopefully we're not on snail's pace for the whole thing. So there are a few key things that I really want to cover today that give rise, I guess, to an ulcer-friendly diet. And probably the most fundamental and hopefully the one that everyone is already doing is providing continuous access to forage. And this might sound easy if your horse is out in a paddock, but you think about when you start to bring them in, even if they're not stabled, if they're in for long periods of time, for traveling, things like that, all of a sudden we start to take away that forage. So we'll cover a few tips around how to make sure that we can address this at all times. We want to, where we can as well, limit grain-based feeds. And I mean, they definitely have a place, and some people might need to use them for their calories, but where we can, especially for a horse struggling with gastric ulceration, we want to limit these, and there's a few reasons why we'll cover that. And lucerne is one of the best forages that you can add to a diet for a horse with ulcers. So we'll talk a bit about the specifics of lucerne, and then some strategic kind of feeding management and things around timing of feeding and exercise and things like that. So a few key points to cover off for horses with gastric ulcers. Oh, the suspense of my slow slides. So the first point I want to cover off is that horses always need to have continuous access to forage. Horses are natural grazers. This is why we always harp on about feeding them little and often, but it's really important specifically for the horse, because if you remember that picture that Petra showed of the entire digestive tract, horses have one of the smallest, if not the smallest, stomach compared to the rest of their gut. So what that means is that food passes through there pretty quickly. If we give them really big meals, then it can't stay in the stomach much longer and has to go to the hindgut and causes lots of problems there. But if we focus on providing continuous forage from a gastric ulcer point of view, we need to still make sure that horses will receive that 1.5 to 2% of their body weight in forage daily. And that's a heck of a lot of forage. So if your horse had, for example, no pasture access, and we're talking like your average 500 kilo horse that we always talk about, it would need at least probably a bale of hay a day. So they need a truckload of forage, and we cannot keep that from them for any length of time. It's really important to not keep your horse from forage for longer than 2 to 4 hours, because as the acid is continuously produced, unlike in humans, where ours actually turns off and on, which is quite clever. So if we start to think about, oh, we wonder what we're having for dinner, or if someone likes McDonald's and they drive past, we'll actually start to turn on our acid production. Horses unfortunately don't have that ability because they've evolved as a constant grazer. So theirs is just trickling in all day, and then you can imagine if we don't put forage in there to help buffer that and create that saliva, then that acid will start to cause some problems for our horse. So it will mostly cause problems, for example, if we start to ride them on an empty stomach, and then you imagine there's no forage in there to buffer that, there's no fiber mat in the stomach, that acid will just splash straight up onto that unprotected squamous stomach lining, which is really, really painful for the horse. And then what we'll see as horse owners is we'll probably see behavioural issues, or our horse reacting to us. For example, one of the reasons why girthiness is a really common problem. So just a couple of things to keep in mind. Remember that the horse always secretes stomach acid, so we always need to give them forage. And just as an indication, if you are stabling your horse and you come every morning and they're completely out of hay or out of whatever forages that you're giving them, it's probably a good indication that they do need some more. So without getting too heavy in numbers and what they need, try to meet that 1.5 to 2% daily. But use that as a gauge, and then what you can do is just slowly increase their hay overnight, and then when they've got some left, you know that they've had access all night, which is a really good place to be in.
Nikita, I think that's such a powerful point because so many people stable their horses for lots of reasons. And they'll often say, yeah, I give my horse hay, and I'll say how much we'll give them a biscuit. And then I say, well, watch them, because that biscuit of hay can be gone within the first hour. They can be going 10 hours without any feed. And so, we talk about using slow hay feeders. I'm not sure if you'll mention that in a moment, but trying to find ways that you can make it continuous. Nikita, just a quick question that's come through. It's about having constant access to fiber so the horse's stomach isn't empty. Thinking about times of travel, what are your thoughts about providing fiber or forage or hay when a horse is traveling? And Petra, you might want to jump in and answer this one as well from a vet point of view.
So from my perspective, and then Petra can jump in, I absolutely love the idea of feeding forage whilst traveling. Some people will be concerned about things like choke, but if we're feeding the right feeds, then I think the risk is pretty minimal. So you can have choke risk, for example, if you're feeding like straw, if straw is your main forage source, which we wouldn't recommend anyway. But if you've got a really nice quality lucerne hay or a nice, quality forage source, absolutely feed it while they're traveling. Horses can also increase their acid, like their acid production might increase a little bit in times of stress as well. So if you think about during travel, then it's an additional risk factor for developing gastric ulcers. But if you don't have the ability to feed in your truck or float, then at least offer forage to them before you take off. So make sure that they've got some forage in their stomach, and ideally that would be lucerne. So that's what I tell all my clients to do. Make sure they're having lucerne before they get on the float, and then think about stopping at that kind of 2 to 4 hour intervals if you're traveling for a long time. Definitely offer them water at those times, and also offer them some good quality forage.
Thanks, Nikita. Petra, do you want to add to that at all?
I think Nikita's covered most of the things I would have said about traveling, to be honest. Yeah, I agree. If it depends on how far you're traveling, and obviously in New Zealand we don't often have as far to travel as you guys in Australia, but I'd hate to see some of your horses, I know a lot of race horses or competition horses have a massive travel, and I just think that is far too long without hay. So as Nikita said, if they can't have it in the truck, then they need to have regular stops. But also, yeah, again, choosing a forage that's going to form a nice mat, because not only if they're continuously chewing are they having buffering saliva come down, but if there's a feed that's a nice sort of chop size that forms a sort of a mat, it's sort of, yes, it's almost like a blanket on top of the acid and stops it coming back up.
Yeah, no, fabulous. It's a question we get asked a lot, and I think that we do travel our horses a long time. And there has been in the past that belief that you can just use omeprazole on and off for travel. I think we need to think about, alternatives. And just one other question, we've talked a lot about lucerne. Your thoughts on feeding that to horses with glandular ulcers, Nikita?
So I don't have an issue with feeding it to horses with glandular ulcers. In fact, I would feed it. We did some trial work with lucerne, and others might have differing opinions, but where we got some healing and prevention in both squamous and glandular by adding lucerne to the diet. So to me, it's really protective. Diet is not going to have, I guess, as much of an impact probably on glandular ulcers as it will on squamous. But we still want to make sure that we're meeting their forage requirement. And to me, lucerne is kind of gold standard when it comes to ulceration. If you don't have any lucerne, or for one reason or another your horse doesn't agree with lucerne, then absolutely feed another forage. It will still be buffering because you're still chewing, still providing saliva. But lucerne, because it's really high in calcium and also the specific proteins in there, it can actually not only be buffering, but also can help with the stomach wall, we think, as well, in terms of healing. So, yeah, that's my thoughts.
Thank you. I know we are covering lucerne. I just saw the question come up in the chat, so I thought I'd bring it up now. So yeah, keep going.
So I talked a bit about limiting grain-based feeds where we can, and this is a really effective strategy to help manage gastric ulcers from coming back. So often we we can remove or we can reduce the amount of grain in our horse's diet without any ill effects. But for horses that are recovering from gastric ulcers, it can be a really good part of their management program. And there's a few reasons for this, but the main reason is really that grains are actually more acid forming, if you like. So what that means is essentially they will drive down the pH in the stomach acid. So where Linda was talking about how it's really acidic already, and then if we put grains into the mix, it actually makes it even more acidic. So then you think about when that acid splashes up onto the squamous part of the stomach, which is unprotected and doesn't like acid, then it's going to be worse, right? So the acid injury, the potential for acid injury in that unprotected squamous epithelium is far greater. So there's some good guidelines around how much grain we should feed, and as a guideline, you don't want to really feed more than 100 grams of starch per 100 kilos of body weight. So a gram of starch for a kilo of body weight. So that might sound like not much, or it might sound like a lot. But if you think about, for example, maize, that's in a lot of horse feeds, and it doesn't matter, unfortunately, if it's extruded, micronized, how it's processed in terms of gastric ulcers, because it doesn't matter to much extent, because the amount of starch in there will dictate how acidic we get in the stomach. So maize, for example, is 60 to 70% roughly in starch. So you think about if you fed 1 kilo of maize to a horse, which you probably, I wouldn't say a lot of you would, but it's definitely in a lot of horse feeds. So if you fed a kilo, then you're looking at 600 or 700 grams. So all of a sudden, you are at their starch limit before you even put anything else into the system. Oats are actually the safest grain from a starch perspective. So they can get a bit of a bad rap. The starch and sugar is really readily available, so it gives a nice quick energy source. But if you are going to feed a grain, then that's probably your ulcer-friendly option, if you like, because they've actually got the lowest amount of starch of all the grains. So the third point that I've already talked about a lot is the importance of adding lucerne to the diet. And this is something that I would like to see in all horses' diets that have gastric ulceration. They do need a decent amount of it for it to be really effective. So ideally somewhere between 2 and 6 kilos. I mentioned previously we've done some trials with lucerne around feeding and prevention. So think about those kind of numbers. So if you think about you've got a horse that you feed 2 or 3 times a day, or you're traveling, then if you're making sure that before travel feed was, say, a kilo of lucerne, and then you've got a kilo going into each of your meals, then all of a sudden you start to reach those decent effects in order to maximize its buffering effect. It's a really good one to feed before exercising and before traveling, especially if it's long stem as well. Petra mentioned the fibre mat, and that can be really useful for a horse, especially if we're exercising for any length of time. And sorry, the chat's just coming up over my screen. So it's great that you guys have got all these questions. So also feeding lucerne after your omeprazole administration, and do this on the advice of your vet, but it can actually further support your treatment. And one of the things that I think this is the last point around feeding, is really think a bit strategically around how you're going to feed your horse with gastric ulcers. We've already talked about pre-exercise and pre-travel feeding. Another thing that you can do is actually feed your forage, especially if it's lucerne, it's going to have a really positive effect. Feed it before any grain-based feeds, and that will help buffer things before the grain gets there and help kind of counteract the acidity of the grain. There was some work done in horses that looked at a lucerne and grain diet compared with just a forage diet, but that didn't have lucerne. And the lucerne with grain diet actually did better in terms of horses with gastric ulcers. So lucerne is really protective in that regard. Think about timing, and Petra mentioned around timing for exercise as well. And this can be really important, especially if your horse, for example, is stabled overnight. So you think about a horse that's stabled overnight, if they've gone a while without having forage, so if they were that example that Linda mentioned and they've had the 1 or 2 biscuits even overnight, then they might have had quite a period of time with an empty stomach, with no buffering and with lots of acid getting produced. You think about that horse then, if you didn't give it some form of forage before you went out and worked it, you're going to get a heap of acid splash happening. And it's really common actually in the racing industry, especially. We work our horses early in the morning, right? So, and often they'll actually get a pre-work feed, but that can be really high in grain. So remember what I said about grain being acid producing, so that's making things worse. We've got an empty stomach with no forage, and then the likelihood of that horse developing gastric ulcers is really high, and that's probably one of the reasons why we see it at kind of 90+% in race and performance horses.
Hey, Nikita, I've seen about 5 different people say, you're talking about lucerne hay or lucerne chaff, or are they interchangeable?
So, I mean, there are some things around chop length that will make it better. So, chop length as well as maturity and how much a horse actually physically has to chew a feed can affect that fibre mat in the stomach. But in terms of its buffering capacity from a high calcium and the protein in the lucerne point of view, then it doesn't matter. But from that physical kind of fibre mat level, then we would want some of that lucerne ideally to be a longer chop length or a kind of long stem if we can. And also there's a lot of variation in chaffs. We have some really good products in New Zealand, but chaff, for example, can be really hit and miss, I call it. So we can have some decent chop length coming through, and then you can have like a bag of dust sometimes. And you think about a horse that's not going to have to chew as much to break that physical fibre down, so you're going to get less buffering. Oh, it's still me, and I was waiting for something next. Here we go.
Sorry, I interrupted you, but I saw so many people wanting that clarified.
No, you're fine. I keep waving away the questions so I can see my slides. So it's a really good idea to take a look at your horse's diet whilst they're getting treated for gastric ulcers. Look at adjusting their forage if you can, remove or reduce the amount of grain. And then Erin is going to cover in more detail the supportive supplements, for example, the Poseidon products, things like that can really help support the horse's gut. And I get asked quite a lot, if our horse is just on a forage diet, isn't that's what they were designed to eat, and I don't feed any grain, so I shouldn't need any of those extras. Well, I guess my answer to that is our horses are doing things that they wouldn't do in the wild. We actually put a lot of stress on them, whether that be just taking them away from their favourite paddock mate for the day, or pulling them in to pull their mane or plait them up, or whatever. We are actually putting more stress on our horses than they would experience naturally. So I think that's where the supportive supplements have a real key role in today's horses. So with your hard feeds and your supplements, remember always to weigh these out. And it's amazing, but I still, you guys might know what I'm talking about when I talk about like the 1 kilo scoop. But that's the typical ones that you'll see feed companies have and provide. And it's amazing how many people say, oh, yeah, I'm feeding a kilo of lucerne chaff, and then we go and weigh it out. But they're feeding a kilo scoop, which of course is about 200 grams of chaff. So just remember, if you have one thing in your feed room, I'd love to see some more scales in people's feed rooms. Take a look at your hays and your conserved forages. So make sure that you're feeding enough, again, meeting those requirements that we talked about before. And remember that every time you take your horse off pasture, you're kind of limiting their ability to eat. So we need to make sure that we make up for that with some alternative forage sources. Just to get into some specifics really quickly around the two types of ulcers and some of the things that we can do to help avoid each. So remember that the squamous ulcers are at the top part of the stomach. That's the stomach lining that doesn't have protection from stomach acid. So here we really want to make sure we avoid those prolonged periods without forage. Feeding lucerne prior to our concentrate feeds or our hard feeds will really help here as well. Where you can, please offer 24-hour paddock turnout time. But if they do need to come in, then make sure that you're topping up their forages. One of the key things that some researchers have found is that also reducing the time that you're exercising your horse. So especially high intensity exercise. So if you think about the horse's stomach and think about when you're starting to canter and jump them, you'll get more of that acid splash. So keep those that high intensity exercise to a minimum where you can, and don't do it for long periods of time. Make sure they're fed before that exercise, obviously, is really going to help reduce the risk of ulceration. For our glandular ulcers, it's actually more important to give these horses rest days and increase turnout time. So for the squamous ulcers, shorter bouts of exercise are beneficial. For horses with these glandular ulcers that we think are more related to some kind of disruption of that protective layer, often things like stress of medication or other stresses can cause this. So giving them those days off will really help, and try and, if you can, have a rest day between working days. For these horses as well, they will really benefit from more regular routines and exercise schedules. So even things like the person that's feeding your horse, for example, if you've got someone feeding them while you're away, that can become a risk factor. So try to reduce these changes in management and people that are dealing with your horse on a day-to-day basis. Reduce stress where you can. It can be easier said than done, but look for the things that you think stress your horse out, and this can be beneficial to the whole gut, so not just from the point of gastric ulceration, but for hindgut issues and everything. If we can reduce some of the stresses, it will be really beneficial. I've said probably about 5 million times already, but lucerne will be really beneficial to buffer the stomach pH. So if you've got a new horse especially, or if you're changing your horse's diet, Poseidon have this really cool program called Feed Assist that's on their website, and we've recently kind of revamped it a bit so that you can actually put in, it'll go through an example here. You basically put in your horse's details, what they're doing, what breed they are, how much they weigh, all those kind of things. I think I'm talking faster than the slide for once. So we've got a warm blood gelding here. And the really cool thing about this is that it gives you the ability to select if your horse is prone to gastric ulcers, as well as a number of other conditions, things like laminitis, tying up. And then what Feed Assist will do is it will make sure that your diet is safe, and it will also give you some specific recommendations around how to help your horse from a management perspective. So some of the things that we've covered tonight This will spit you out a lovely report and give you a nice balanced diet as well. It will also cover something that Erin's going to talk about in more detail, but around the inclusion of stress pace. I was just going to briefly touch on stress pace because it actually gives you a protocol of how to use stress pace when you're changing a diet. So it gives you basically another form of protection for your horse as you're changing their diet. We always recommend to do changes slowly over a minimum of kind of 14 days or 2 weeks. Using stress pace kind of ramps that up so that the horse doesn't struggle as much with the transition, essentially. And always ensure that your horse has access to 24/7 forage. I think that goes without saying. The other thing is make sure that you've always got water going in when we've got forage going in too, because if this is probably more important for the hindgut, but you think about the little bugs in the hindgut, they're like little fish and they can't live out of water. So really important there from a complete gut health perspective. And I did briefly touch on some of the supportive supplements. So things, for example, Poseidon have digestive EQ and HP. For any horse that that was being treated for gastric ulcers, I would go straight to HP, which is basically the supercharged version of EQ, and that will provide buffering and a number of different things, protection for this.
Can I just jump in? Just want to say that it's called digestive RP in Australia at the moment, but we are changing it to HP so avoid confusion. And I just want to say one thing too before we jump into the case study. Feed Assist is an amazing tool. It is free. I spoke earlier about we've got to stop guessing. We just get confused about feeding. So we have taken that confusion away, and actually Feed Assist will only recommend diets that we think are great for the gut. So there's no excuse, and you can jump on and use that as often as you like. If the competition level or exercise level of your horse changes or whatever, if you want them to lose weight, put on weight, whatever, it's there and it's free. And Nikita has been working and Erin on it to make it a better software program, a better program for you. So please use it. It is actually incredible. I wish it had been around when I was first trying to understand about nutrition, because up until starting Poseidon, I was always confused about diets. And that's one of the things we hear from horse owners all the time. I don't know how to create a diet. Well, this will help you. And if it does say we can't create a diet for you, it then goes through to our nutritionist, which is Nikita, who can then say, well, the reason it wouldn't create a diet is you didn't have enough fiber. So it's actually foolproof. So please, please use it. Sorry, Nikita, I just wanted to jump in and say that before we jump on to Archie.
No, that's fine. And if it is an amazing program, and it's actually really cool to see how many people are using Feed Assist now. So I obviously see the reports coming through, and then people also having questions once they've got their report. So feel free to come through with those questions too. It's a super, super cool program. So we will dive into a little case study here, and this is a horse called Archie in Australia that we worked with, must have been last year, Linda. Yeah. And Archie kind of came to us as a bit of a lost cause, and his owner, Rachel, was basically had tried everything. And I mean, this horse had been on omeprazole for a long, long time. We talk about long-term omeprazole and how we don't want to be using it that way. And this horse had been on basically years of on and off omeprazole, different diets, she thought she'd tried everything and nothing really worked. So that's where we kind of came in. Archie was he is, not was, an 11-year-old warm blood gelding. And we basically did a full gut health assessment with him. His challenges were gastric ulcers. He had never had a clean scope in the whole time that Rachel had him. And I think she'd had him 7 years or around that time. He had some really funny behavioural quirks. And some things that, were not only stressing him out, but stressing his owner out. So he was essentially we think, you know, in a lot of pain, and he was showing his owner that in a number of different ways. So we had a not very happy horse and a not very happy owner at the start of this. So our goals were really to improve gut health, improve performance, happy horse, happy owner. So this is just a huge list of things that Archie was doing. So I mentioned some of the quirky things that he was doing. He was very anxious when he was traveling and competing, especially. So this is something that we really wanted to address early on. I talked about addressing the risk factors for your horse, and often this is one of the things that will affect a lot of competition horses, is the effect of travel. He was kicking out a lot. He was kicking out a lot in the stable, and causing himself a lot of distress by doing so. He was sensitive even when he was being brushed. His manure was all over the place. She found it difficult to keep weight on him, even though she was feeding him a lot of calories. And when we assessed the diet, you know, it should have been a diet that was meeting his requirements and enabling him to put on weight. But that's one of the first red flags with things like gastric ulcers, is if I look at a diet and on paper it's meeting everything for that horse, but that horse is looking rubbish, then you start to think, okay, there must be something going on in this horse's gut. His canter transitions, especially on the right, were not very good. He wouldn't stand still at all. He was really reactive, and his performance was really bad. And especially when he was away, like he might work okay at home, and then as soon as he was out and about, which when you've you know, got a competition horse, that's not ideal. And as I said, Rachel and Archie both weren't very happy. Just some other things there on the right hand side, most of which we've covered. So he did have an injury early in life, and his mother did possess some kind of similar traits, which often can be things that can be passed down. So important to kind of recognise. And Rachel had a full history because she'd had him, I think, since he was a foal. And he'd been on long-term omeprazole. He had to have bute with when the farrier came, and so he'd also had that combination of bute and omeprazole as well.
Can I just say, Nikita, just Rachel had tried, she just wanted the right thing by this horse, and she'd done everything that was open to her at that point. And so she was at the stage where she was really, you know, frustrated. She knew that things had to change, but just didn't know what else she could do. So I think it's really important. We have a lot of horse owners like that. They just want the best, but they don't know what next step is. And that's what's really frustrating. So this is where the whole gut reset came about. And I just had to share that as well, Nikita, that the frustration for the owners is really, you know, it's challenging. We just want to make things better, but we haven't known how, I guess, up until now.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny because for us at the start of this journey, we're almost kind of, you know, excited because we're thinking about how good things can get for Rachel and Archie, right? Whereas she's just at the end of her tether. She doesn't know what else to try. Like you say, she tried everything. She thought she'd tried everything. And what we did wasn't really rocket science, or, you know, we didn't use crazy potions or anything. You'll see in a second what we actually did. But just some basic improvements. Some of the things I've covered off tonight and those points earlier made a huge difference for Archie. So what we did see was that Archie became much more focused, much more settled. And this happened quite quickly once we introduced the diet changes. Put in, of course, that he was having the Poseidon supplements and some changes to his forage and his feeding regime. He'd obviously, I mentioned he had really inconsistent manure before, so that can be a real red flag in terms of some gut issues going on. So this this really improved over time, and I was getting some nice photos through weekly from Rachel of her horse's poop, which I love to see. So if anyone wants to flood my inbox with horse poop pictures, feel free. And because he'd been on this long-term omeprazole, you know, he basically wasn't responding to it either. So he'd been on omeprazole for a long time. He'd also had lower than ideal fibre intake. So remember I talked about meeting that fibre requirement. We basically addressed this and addressed his supplement program, and we had a different horse within a matter of weeks. We knew that travel and competition were a real trigger for Rachel and Archie. So we made sure to do things. For example, we got Rachel to give Archie stress paste before he was aware that he was going on the float. So there were a few really early mornings, but things like that can make a real difference, because once Rachel had the float out and, you know, he knew things were happening, then it was actually too late to start to put in any management. So that's why it's really important. We all know our horses better than anyone else, so know what their triggers are and know how to manage them. Now, this is some quite cool kind of geeky stuff, I guess, but I did talk about previously how I've converted many a kitchen into a fecal measurement lab. So one of the things that we measure, and this is more related to hindgut, but we measure fecal pH, and this gives us an indication basically of how happy the hindgut is, but it can also give us an indication of what's happening further up the digestive tract, so the stomach and small intestine, because often where horses are struggling, we get acid spillover and we get the effects of an really acidic stomach and problems in the stomach flowing through to the hindgut. So it can be a bit of an indicator. So we did measure fecal pH here. You'll see at the start of the trial, it was actually just above 6.5. So at this point, I think we'd already introduced some changes, because it can be quite difficult when you're working with a horse. Straight away, you want to say, okay, initially do this, this, and this before we get a chance to look at everything completely. So it had probably already started to come up a little bit. Usually a horse that has clinical signs of anything going on, anything below 6.5, I will start to think, okay, what do we need to do from a diet and management perspective? So you can see over the first wee while in this trial with Archie that his pH crept up, and that was really looking really good to us. And at the same time that we're seeing this, we're seeing the behavioural improvement. So it's quite cool that we can put a measure like this and match it to what's happening for the horse owner on the outside. And basically all we did was a combination of a low starch diet. So we slowly reduced the amount of starch or grain-based feeds in Archie's diet. We upped the lucerne in the diet. We put him on digestive HP, and we used stress paste strategically. So we used it when we were introducing the HP or the RP, and then we also used it when we took away his omeprazole. So we were getting questioned heavily, I think, by the vets at this point, and I guess Rachel was probably a bit reluctant initially to take away the omeprazole. We took it away, I think, where the red line is, and you do see a little drop there in pH, which is kind of interesting. But see, then he obviously had the support of a good diet and a good supplement program, and then came back up. And then you'll also see, and then he maintained a good pH. So he's maintained a good pH throughout that time. And whilst that doesn't tell us much from a gastric ulceration point of view, what was really cool is at the end of this, they scoped Archie, and we're all, sitting there, can't wait, because we knew, well, we thought we knew that he would be good, he would be clear, because his behaviour was good, his performance was good, he was looking $1 million, his condition had improved. We had a happy horse at that time, so we just needed confirmation. And then it was the first time that he'd scoped clear of ulceration since in the 7 years that, I think it was 7 years that Rachel had Archie. So, which was pretty amazing, and the vets were actually quite blown away. They'd never seen a scope for Archie look that good, and they'd scoped him many times. So that was really cool. The green line there just shows he actually had an unfortunate floating accident, but we continue to monitor the pH and things. And I believe that because he was on such a good program, which included Lucerne, low starch, and digestive HP, and we used stress paste strategically, that he was able to be basically protected from his gut going downhill. What we see a lot of the time, really interesting, I was just on a property the other day, where we've come in and fecal pH some horses, and then one of the horses came back low, and then we started to talk about what's been happening with that horse lately. Okay, he's dropped some weight, and then what happened before that? Oh, he had an abscess. And so some things that can be completely unrelated that you think then have an effect on the gut. So if we support that gut through the good times and the bad, then we make sure that we protect our horses and give them the best chance to have a healthy gut.
It was an exciting case study, and we're going to hear back from Rachel in a moment, but that was the start of creating lots of protocols, and Erin's going to share another case study at the end about a similar experience.
His top line has improved out of sight, his muscle tone, his coat.
The story of Archie is a testament to how good gut health can completely turn your horse's life around.
So I'm Rachel Clark. My horse Archie, he's a 3/4 thoroughbred. We've struggled with him being anxious, having ulcers. He's had a significant history of ulcers. We have had him scoped numerous times over the years, and the thing that inspired me to focus on Archie's gut health was his lack of condition. His performance had no energy to do what we wanted him to do. I decided on the specific changes in Archie's diet because of Poseidon. We're using Poseidon's digestive HP and the stress paste when we need it. His top line has improved out of sight, his muscle tone, his coat. My mindset's totally changed. For the first time when we scoped him, he had a beautiful clean stomach. Yeah, it was an exciting day. It's much more enjoyable when you know he's happy and he's enjoying his work.
Rachel is absolutely thrilled with her results. Nikita, thank you so much for that. Seeing lots of great questions coming through. Just a reminder, we'll get those answers to you post the webinar sometime next week. So Erin, you've been very patiently waiting, given it's so early in the morning over there. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Very early in the morning here, so I'll try to get with it. But thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you Petra and Nikita for, I'm sure, doing an excellent job providing the information. So, you know, we've had a lot of questions come through about what you can do with your diet and how to either heal ulcers or prevent them coming back. So we're going to talk through a little bit how we use supplements. Oh, I see. So the case study that I'm going to talk about is actually a similar horse to Archie in that he's a dressage horse. His name is Centurio, and I actually have been dealing with Centurio, or Chi-Chi. He is a horse that I've been seeing here in the US and is an 18-year-old warm blood gelding. He has struggled with a repeated series of gastric ulcers. Not sure what we've got. Sorry, everything's happening here. So Centurio was an FEI dressage horse, and he had been competing really well throughout his career with a professional. He was then sold to an amateur rider in a different state. So he sort of had to travel. He changed owners, he changed riders, he changed management and diet all of the things that happen to a horse when they go to a new home, particularly if it's far away. He also then sustained a soft tissue injury, which required box rest and some medication. And these are kind of common factors that we see influencing horses that develop ulcers, is that they experience these different stressors, and normally stressors sort of pile on top of each other. And when we get enough stressors, the horse is no longer able to cope. So Centurio started to present with what we, was called by the trainers bad behavior. And he was scoped, found to have glandular and squamous ulcers, and he was treated. It took a couple of rounds of treatment, and he wasn't really improving. So we saw some improvement in him with each round of treatment of omeprazole and misoprostol, but not huge improvements. He certainly wasn't the horse that he had been before being diagnosed with ulcers. Once he had sort of improved to a point that he was no longer displaying this bad behavior, he was then sent to another state to a trainer to be sold, because his amateur rider had become intimidated by his bad behavior and wasn't really trusting that he would be safe again to ride, even if they could get the ulcers under control. He was with his trainer the new trainer for about 4 months, and he was going well with the trainer. She had made some diet and management changes, knowing that he had this history of ulcers, and he was coping well with that program. He was then sold to a new amateur owner for 10% of his original sale price. And this new amateur knew that he had this history of gastric ulcers, but was interested in taking a chance on him. With the new owner, unfortunately, his bad behavior returned. So she went through the same process, scoping. This time they tried omeprazole and sucralfate, and they made extensive diet and management changes. So they tried to give him as much turnout as possible. They provided him with a friend. She hired a PhD nutritionist to completely revamp his entire nutrition and management program, which I always recommend. She did all of the things she could, and every time they stopped treating him for ulcers, his ulcers would come back within sort of 1 to 3 months. So she went a couple of rounds of this and was very frustrated that she had this lovely horse who she genuinely didn't believe was a bad horse, but she kept having these problems. So what we ended up doing with Centurio was I met his owner. This is Chris that we'll watch here in the video in a second. And I met her sort of at the end of her rope, a little bit similar to Rachel and Archie's story, where she'd been through 3 rounds of treatment. She'd done all the diet and management changes, and she still was having these issues with Centurio's behavior. At that point, she was willing to take a chance. So we put Centurio, or Chi-Chi, on our ulcer protocol, which involves using stress paste, as Nikita discussed, when starting digestive HP, which is what we call it here in the US. I keep the horse on digestive HP for a month while continuing ulcer treatment. And then when stopping the ulcer treatment, we do another round of stress paste. So the same protocol that was used with Archie, we used with Chi-Chi. I did have some questions come through about tapering omeprazole versus stopping it cold turkey. In my opinion, the current science is telling us to stop it cold turkey, not to taper anymore. Obviously, every vet has their own opinion, but for me, what I've been seen to be most successful is stopping the omeprazole cold turkey while supporting the gut with other preventatives, such as stress paste and digestive HP. And then Chi-Chi has not been treated for ulcers since we went through that protocol. And we're now 3 months out. He is competing. He is doing really well. His condition has improved. All of his bad behavior has gone away. His coat has improved. His tail has improved, which is very important to Chris. She's always sending me photos of Chi-Chi's tail because he had a terrible tail. And she now has this amazing horse that she always knew was in there because we've been able to remove his pain. So we're gonna hear from Chris.
My name is Christina Blankenship, and these are my horses, Centurio and Helios. And both of them have different digestive issues. Helios had fecal water syndrome after dehydrating really severely. And Centurio came to me with really severe ulcer issues. He would pretty much rear and stand up on both hind legs, and really be difficult when he was in pain. And we got the vets involved and did all the things that vets do, which is the sucralfate, omeprazole, and we did the course that was recommended. We took him off and got the same result. So we did another course and got the same result, and did another course and tried everything. We managed the diet. We spoke with nutritionists. We did everything that every expert told us to do. And my horse was still in pain. And this is him today. At regionals, I met with Dr. Erin Roddy, and she told us about the product. After regionals, put him on her protocol for weaning off of the omeprazole. So he started taking digestive HP, and we put him on that for a month. After the month, we weaned him off of the GastroGuard and followed the protocol. We also used stress paste for him, and he is a changed animal. He took me down Center Line this weekend. We won our class with a 61.9. I'm super happy to endorse this product. It is a game changer. We're able to restore their microbiome. His fecal water syndrome is normal, and I'm hoping to be able to compete with both of them for a long time without having to resort to very expensive drugs that just mask the problem instead of fixing it.
Chris is very happy that she's got her horse that she took the gamble on back to being able to be ridden. And what's amazing about Chi-Chi is that his scores have continued to improve. So the last show she went to, the scores had gone from a 61 to a 65 to a 67. So as his entire health improves, his ability to perform is improved. And I think one of my favorite things about this case is that this is an 18-year-old horse who had a history of being a good horse. And then when he was in pain, he started to behave badly. We actually just had a question come through. Someone asked, can we acknowledge that sometimes behavior is related to emotion? And I actually am not really willing to acknowledge that. I think that horses are trying to tell us something with their behavior. Now, maybe that's that they don't understand the question, or maybe they're uncomfortable with the question. But a lot of times in my experience, horses that behave badly are in some kind of pain. May not be always gastric ulcer pain, but there is something going on with that horse that they're not happy about. I genuinely do not believe that horses are bad. They're trying to tell you that they are uncomfortable with something, whether that's something physical or psychological, that's a discomfort. For Chi-Chi, as soon as we were able to remove that discomfort, he went right back to being the good horse that he had been for so much of his life. He didn't hold a grudge against his humans who had caused this pain. And he is only performing better and better the healthier he gets. So that's a really amazing thing about horses, that they're so forgiving and so willing to keep trying. And obviously, Chris is delighted that she has her horse. So we've spoken about this protocol that we use. And it's actually the same protocol, whether you're changing diets or you're changing housing, or you are introducing HP or RP for the first time, or if you're dealing with a horse with gastric ulceration. So we start the first few days with stress paste, and that is, as Nikita said, sort of jump-starting the system as we are introducing the HP or the RP. We continue that for a few days, and then once we finish that loading dose of stress paste, the horse is getting a larger dose of HP or RP. I know a lot of people are used to feeding calming supplements or joint supplements where you have a loading dose that is larger than the maintenance dose. For a gut supplement, it's important to start slowly and then build up. So it's sort of the opposite effect. And that's because anytime we're changing the gut, even if it's for the best, my favorite example of this is people get racehorses off the track and they want to do the right thing by the racehorse. And so they stop all the cereal grain and they start feeding them beautiful hay and they turn them out on pasture, and the horse falls in an absolute hole. And while you might be introducing the best diet possible for that horse isn't ready to digest and absorb that diet. So you need to make those changes slowly. Even if it's a change for the better, it still needs to be made slowly. And Nikita discussed that a little bit with Archie. You meet a horse like Archie and you just want to change everything, and you can't do that to the horse. Even if the changes are positive, that will cause more stress to the horse. Horses are not designed to cope with rapid change. So we introduce the HP slowly. We use the stress paste to support that introduction. And then once we've had the HP on board for about a month, and that's not a hard and fast rule. A lot of horses have so much stress or so much chronic damage, or they have been, dysregulated for such a long time that sometimes I'll use the HP for 1 month, 2 months, or even 3 months before I go, yeah, this horse is ready for the next stage where we're actually going to stop medication. Especially here in the States, I meet a lot of horses that are on a number of medications. And I don't like to stop everything all at once. So we might remove one medication, do a round of stress pace. Then we might wait another month, remove another medication, do a round of stress pace. So every time we're making a big change in that horse's medication protocol or their diet, we're going to do that round of 3 to 5 days of stress pace to support their gut through that. So this is the protocol that we use. And that's what was done with Archie and with Chi-Chi. Oh, it gets excited. I told you before. So the first product we're going to talk about is, as Linda mentioned, digestive HP or RP. So that stands for high performance or racing in performance. And what is important about these products as opposed to digestive EQ, which a lot of people are familiar with and which Nikita mentioned earlier, is that this is sort of the souped up version. So the active ingredients are included at a higher level of efficacy. And this is the product that we really want to choose if our horse is experiencing a lot of stress, or if for me, they've had a history of a gastrointestinal disturbance, or they're at a risk of gastrointestinal disturbance. This is the product that I'm going to reach for. So this is our complete foundational gut health supplement. It does the entire GI tract from the stomach to the hindgut. And that's really important because none of these organs exist in a vacuum. The stomach is connected to the rest of the GI tract, as is the hindgut connected to the stomach. So you can't just focus on one organ. Even if you know you have a gastric ulcer issue, in most of those horses that I see with gastric ulcers, there are other gut issues going on. It's just that the stomach is the only organ that we can actually image. So I think it's really important to address the entire GI tract, and particularly in a horse like Chi-Chi, where we knew that actually diet and management changes had been done. She was one of the few owners that I meet where I go, I'm actually not going to change anything about your diet or your management. You're doing a really good job on both of those fronts. And still her horse was having issues. And that was just because of the level of stress that he was under, trying to do his job, trying to live in the state of Florida here in the US, which is quite a hot and humid state. And because of the way that he lived, he was stabled quite a lot. He had turnout as much as possible, but it wasn't enough. So HP contains a really amazing suite of ingredients. And what's important about the ingredients is that they be included at active levels. And you see a lot of products on the market that might have 1 ingredient or 2 ingredients that are active, but not at the effective levels that we need to see to actually affect a change in the horse. So when you build a supplement in the way that we've done it, what you do is you look at the research and you go, okay, what ingredient is actually affecting a change? At what level is it going to affect a change? And with what other ingredients does it work well in combination? And it's really important to answer those questions. And there's a lot of products in the market that don't answer those questions effectively, which is why they don't work as well. So we sort of hit a lot of the points that Petra and Nikita have discussed, which is obviously the pH buffering. That's really important. That's what we're seeing from our Lucent hay. We've had a lot of questions come through about not being able to feed Lucent hay, whether that's from access or horses with weight issues or simply the amount of exercise that the horse does. And that's where buffering from a supplement can come in handy. And then again, supporting the entire gut and using ingredients like the amino acids, which help repair and protect the lining of the GI tract and can actually help heal ulcers. And digestive enzymes are really important in a horse so that we prevent that starch from falling into the hindgut, where it can actually cause hindgut acidosis, which is a different webinar, but important to keep in mind. And we touched on that a little bit with Archie's pH of his manure, is that we're actually checking the pH in that hindgut. Slides want to play with me. So it's important to feed HP every day. Ideally, I like it to be fed twice a day. In horses like Chi-Chi that are really having ulcer issues, I will recommend to the owner that they feed HP 3 times a day. And that's just because the buffering, even though we use the best buffers that are available on the market, that buffering really works for about 4 hours after being fed. So the more often it's fed in the day, particularly in a horse that has a risk of gastric ulcers or is healing from gastric ulcers is just going to be beneficial for us. Again, we've spoken about including those active ingredients at effective levels and not having fillers, sugars, starch, soy. Those things shouldn't be in a supplement because they're not actually doing anything for your horse. So if you are currently feeding a supplement, I always recommend people read the label and see what's in there that's an active ingredient and what's in there that's not an active ingredient and that it might be a filler. If you're spending money on a filler, you're really wasting your money. That's not doing anything for your horse. So now we're going to move on to stress paste, and stress paste is a really, really important element in any of these gut protocols that we're talking about, particularly in horses with gastric ulcers. You know, stress paste was developed by Dr. Nerida Richards, who is also an amazing nutritionist, not with us tonight, but she really understood that we can't untrain human beings. And so human beings really want to give their horses a tube when their horse is stressed, and we're not going to change that desire. So we're going to give you a tube that you can give your horse when they're stressed, but it's a tube that's actually going to protect the stomach. I see a lot of people that think that omeprazole, whether that's in the GastroGuard or UlcerGuard form, or even in a compounded powder or a pellet, is actually going to coat and protect their horse's stomach. And that's not what omeprazole does, as Petra discussed. It is going to stop your horse from producing acid by killing the horse's acid cells, but it's not actually going to provide protection from the acid. Stress paste actually does that. So it is designed to be given orally over the tongue. It can also be mixed in feed. A lot of people have asked that question, and I certainly have a number of horses that are not interested in having a tube put in their mouth, and rather than fight with them, that is actually absolutely fine. We can mix it through feed. It does not need to be given on an empty stomach. So that also eases, you know, a horse like Chi Chi, where we're trying to do everything right. We're fasting him for a period of time overnight. Then we're giving the omeprazole on an empty stomach. Then we're waiting an hour and we're giving him some alfalfa hay. Then we're waiting another hour before we're giving him any kind of grain meal. That becomes very time consuming and difficult from a logistics standpoint. So stress paste can be fed right alongside a meal. It can be mixed through the feed. It does a really good job of addressing all of the forms of physiological stress that we see in a horse. So when stress is applied to the system, there is a change in the horse's physiology. We've talked a lot about the change that happens in the stomach, but we also see changes right throughout the horse. So into the hindgut, in the small intestine, in the muscles, in what the horse is actually able to produce from their food, we see changes. So in order to address those changes and allow the horses to cope with stress, we've included a group of ingredients that actually support them and prevent their body seeing too much effect of that physiological change. So anytime your horse might be stressed, whether you are stopping medication, whether you're introducing a new diet, whether you're traveling, competing, I have a lot of people that use stress paste when the farrier is coming, because that's actually stressful for a lot of horses. Here in Florida, we see a lot of rapid changes in weather. I lived in Camden, New South Wales for 12 years, and we had a lot of changes in weather in Camden as well. You could have very cold nights, warm days. Sometimes it would rain for days on end. We would have a run of 45-degree days. Those things are stressful for horses. That's not what horses were designed or evolved to cope with, as Linda mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. So it's really important that we support horses through those stresses that they're now encountering in their modern day life, and stress paste is the perfect way to do that.
Erin, can I just jump in quickly? I was at an event today and talking to an owner and said, oh, look, my horse won't take stress paste, it hates the syringe. And I said, that's like, most horses love it. So I said, let's try this. We squirted it, put it on my fingers, and he just leaked and leaked and leaked and leaked. And the owner was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that. It was, and then he was looking for more. So, you know, I think you made the point. They don't like the syringe, just find another way for them to take it.
Absolutely. And I know a lot of horses, particularly from dewormers or other medications they may have encountered, that as soon as a syringe is involved, they're really not interested. And that is the beauty of this product over something like omeprazole, where it can be mixed through feed. It doesn't need to be fed on an empty stomach. Like I said, what you did, Linda, feeding it out of the hand or even just mixing it with a small amount of chaff is fine. A lot of horses will just lick it right off your fingers. And I do find it actually smells a little bit like Vegemite, and it does have a bit of a tangy taste to it because of the B vitamins. But I do find that horses actually like it more and more the more they're given it. I think they know that it's going to make their tummy feel better. And so once they've had a few doses of stress paste, they do really go looking for it. So we've talked about some times that you can use it. Obviously, post-treatment transition from omeprazole is really important. Another interesting part of Chi-Chi's case, which I like to talk about because it's a testament to Chris as an owner, and she is an amazing owner, but also a really interesting point to keep in mind, especially for our people that are questioning behavior in horses. So a couple of months into Chi-Chi's transition after omeprazole, so we had stopped omeprazole, he was on the HP. We'd done 2 rounds of stress paste at that point. We were about 2 months in and about a month out from when Chris was first going to compete Chi-Chi. And she sent me a message saying, oh, you know, Chi-Chi's doing well, but today when I rode him, I just noticed he was getting a little light in the bridle. She'd done sort of her walk and trot work. She'd had a bit of a break. She was going to do her canter work, and she just felt he was a little hesitant to go forward. He was a little bit light in the bridle. He didn't go up. He didn't do any of the behavior he'd been doing before, but she just noticed a small change in him. And she messaged me, and I said, I'd do another round of stress paste, 3 to 5 days straight away again. And he was perfect. And a month later, he went to a show and he was fantastic. And I think just noticing when our horses are showing that first sign of stressful behavior, what we feel looking back is that Chi-Chi had shown those signs to Chris early on in her ownership of him, but she hadn't recognized them because she didn't know the horse that well. She hadn't really been paying attention. She didn't know what to look for. Once she knew what to look for, he was sort of raising that red flag a little bit, saying, oh, I'm a little bit uncomfortable. The training has increased. We're thinking about going to a show. You know, our horses are very good at learning patterns, and they can tell as soon as that pattern starts to change. They know if you're catching them in the middle of the day because the farrier's coming versus catching them at feed time when you normally do, or catching them in the morning when you normally feed them. They know when the lights come on in the barn at 3 in the morning because you're going to go and load up and go to a show early versus 7 when you normally do. So they're very good at picking up on those little changes in patterns because they've evolved to be able to recognize small changes in patterns because that's an indication of a threat. So for Chris, as soon as she noticed that little bit of Chi-Chi's behavior under saddle, she was able to address it by using another few days of stress paste. And I believe that that prevented us from going down another round of ulceration with him. Similar experience at a show. She was using our stress paste protocol as we prescribe, which is 1 tube the night before and then half a tube every day of the show. She said the first day of the show, it was a really difficult environment for Chi-Chi. It was really windy. They were in sort of a covered arena, and so things were flapping. There was a lot of changes in lights. It was very loud. And she said, look, he performed, but he just didn't perform to his best. I said, Chris, I would recommend increasing the stress pace. So let's go half a tube 3 times a day instead, and make sure that that 3rd dose is before you ride tomorrow. And the next day he came out and he was foot perfect, scored a 67 and won the class. So just identifying that your horse is saying, yes, I've been coping well up to this point, but now this extra stress is a little bit too much for me to handle. And protecting that and addressing that is really, really important. And I've had a lot of success with these ulcer horses by just noting those little changes. Maybe they're a little slower to finish their food. Maybe they are getting a little bit girthier when you're tacking them up. Starting to notice the first signs and addressing them rather than waiting till we're all the way down the track with a full-blown ulcer problem. Obviously, if your horse is going to have a gastroscope, they're going to need to be fasted. I do like to use stress paste in those instances, but make sure you check with your vet first and that they're happy with that.
Thank you.
And now I
Erin.
think Linda's going to come through and find out who our winner is.
Look, I mean, gosh, we've covered so much tonight, and we finished up talking about stress and horses. And we agree that possibly the next webinar we have is talking about stress and the fact that our horses every day are just fighting to survive. And we really need to start to understand the impact on stress. So I think tonight we've spoken a lot about gastric ulcers, but stress will have an impact on the whole gut. So I'm thinking that we get our amazing team of experts back for that next webinar. So thank you so much, everyone. We have been answering some questions as we went along rather than leaving them to the end. So if your questions are there, whether in the chat box or the other Q&A, we will find those. They'll be sent to our experts and we'll make sure they're all answered. It has been the most amazing webinar. What I love is that we've tried to keep it simple. And the reason we shared the 2 case studies was to give you hope, to see what it means when it's all put back together. and that you can see what it is you can do, because I'm sure there are some of you here tonight that have been in that cycle of constant gastric ulcers and you want to do the best, but nothing is changing. So one of the things that we do at Poseidon is keep looking at what is the research telling us, how do we do things differently? And the other thing is we keep challenging that we can't always expect quick results for problems that have been around for a long time. So we've covered lots. So many of you have hung around right to the end. So thank you so much for that. I just want to do a shout out to, we have 2 winners and our team will be in touch with you. So Rachel Wall and Kim De Oliveira, I hope I pronounced that correctly. So we'll be in touch and you'll get the gut pack. So again, thank you so much for joining us. We've got some great resources that we'll be sending out to you over the next week or so, because we want to share this information. We have an incredible ebook that we've put together. We want to keep delivering you information that is relevant, that's up to date with science, but that's practical, because as horse owners, we just want to enjoy our horses. We want them to live a life that's free of pain and that they can enjoy our interaction with them as well. So thank you for coming along. Huge shout out to the Poseidon team. Huge shout out to Harry, who is sitting here helping us. He's our technical expert and he's been putting the slides together, and Abby's come and joined us as well. We have a great team, Poseidon. I'm grateful for that. Thank you to the panel for coming along. I know it's late in New Zealand, so thank you. And it's early in Akala. So us Aussies have done okay because it's only 20 to 9. So we've done okay, but thank you so much, everyone. And again, you can fill out the post-webinar poll. We take all your feedback seriously. We take that on board and we try and make our webinars better every single time. And I think they are getting better and our registrations are going up every time. So thank you so much. Have a great night, great day, Erin. And we'll see you for the next webinar. Thanks again.